The boundless prairies of the Wild West did not forgive mistakes, and the main currency here was not gold dust, but a sip of clean water. Settlers moving west faced a reality where the nearest stream could be hundreds of miles away, and a well was a luxury. Their survival depended not on luck, but on knowledge passed down by word of mouth. They learned to read the land like an open book, where every crack and every plant could point to a hidden source of life. A mistake in this reading meant the end of the road for the entire family. Knowledge of finding and purifying water was valued more highly than the ability to shoot. Watch the video to the end to find out why the most obvious source of water could be a deadly trap, and what simple method allowed water to be extracted literally from the air. On the frontier, where science gave way to intuition, the art of dowsing flourished. People who practiced it were called diviners, or water witches. They used a Y-shaped branch of willow or hazel to search for underground water veins. It was believed that the branch in the hands of such a person would begin to bend downward when he passed over a water source. This method had no scientific basis, but in their desperation, the settlers were willing to believe in any miracle. The success of a diviner brought him fame and respect throughout the neighborhood.
A guide in our darkest hours.
The search process looked like a ritual. The dowser slowly walked around the site, holding the branch in front of him with both hands. His movements were focused, and his gaze was fixed on the ground in an attempt to feel the slightest vibration. Some settlers claimed that this method really worked, and that wells dug in the indicated places yielded water. Skeptics, however, believed that dowsers were simply good observers. They unconsciously noticed signs of moist soil or certain types of plants. Whether it was magic or a subtle knowledge of nature, dowsing became part of the folklore of the Wild West. It gave hope where it seemed there was none. The belief in the possibility of finding water in this way kept people's spirits up during the most difficult journeys. Stories about successful diviners were passed from mouth to mouth around evening campfires. They became legends that inspired others not to give up. The ability to find water turned an ordinary person into a savior. Interestingly, the practice of dowsing still exists today in some rural areas. People continue to use this ancient method. Do you agree with this? Please tell us what you think about this. Modern science explains the movement of the branch as an ideomotor effect. Unconscious muscle contractions. A person expecting to find water bends the branch without realizing it. But for the settlers, this was irrelevant. The main thing was the result: finding a source that saved lives. In conditions where every sip counted, the methods did not matter. Only water was important. Thus, dowsers became an integral part of the history of the conquest of the West. They were a symbol of hope and human ingenuity. Their art, albeit controversial, left its mark on frontier culture. The most reliable way to find water was to be able to read the signs of nature. Vegetation was the best indicator of hidden sources. An experienced settler could determine the presence of water from a distance of several miles. Trees such as poplars and willows always grow near water. Their root systems require constant moisture, so their presence in arid areas was a sure sign of an underground stream. A green line of trees winding across the prairie indicated the bed of a dry river where water still existed underground. Thick stands of reeds, cattails, or sedges also signaled the proximity of groundwater. These plants prefer marshy, moist soil. Even if there was no water visible on the surface, the ground beneath them was saturated with moisture. Settlers looked for lowlands, gorges, and canyons. Under the force of gravity, water always flows downhill and accumulates at the lowest points of the terrain. In such places, the chances of finding a source were significantly higher. Places where rock formations came to the surface were especially valuable. Water seeping through porous rock often formed small springs at the foot of the rocks. These springs provided clean, filtered water. Careful observation of the terrain made it possible to predict where rainwater might accumulate. Natural depressions in the rock, small hollows or basins, could contain water reserves after recent rain. These were temporary but vital sources. Even the color of the soil could provide a clue. Darker, damp patches on the ground, especially in the morning, indicated the proximity of groundwater. These were the places to start digging first. Animal trails often led to watering holes. The settlers knew that if several trails converged at a single point in a low-lying area, that was most likely where the water source was located. This was one of the oldest and most reliable methods. However, this method required caution. Watering holes attracted not only herbivores, but also predators. One had to approach such places with great caution. The ability to read the landscape was a key survival skill. It allowed one to find water where an inexperienced eye saw only a dry, lifeless plain. But what if the landscape was completely flat and deserted? You will find the answer to this question, which saved entire caravans in the next chapter. When there were no signs of water on the surface, settlers began to look for it underground. Digging a well was a laborious process, but often the only option. Knowing where to dig was equivalent to salvation. The most promising place to dig was on the outside of a bend in a dry riverbed. Centrifugal force during the flow of water washed out a deeper channel on the outside. Water in such places remained under a layer of sand and gravel for the longest time. The depth of digging depended on the terrain. Sometimes it was enough to dig a meter deep to reach wet sand. In other cases, it was necessary to dig several meters deep. The process was exhausting. People worked in turns using shovels, pickaxes, and buckets to remove the soil. Every centimeter was gained with great difficulty, especially in hard, rocky ground. The first sign of success was a change in the color of the soil. It became darker and colder. Then wet sand appeared. This meant that water was close, and it gave people the strength for the final push. When the pit began to slowly fill with murky water, it was a victory. The first water was scooped out, allowing the source to clear. Gradually, the water became clearer and more suitable for drinking. Such a primitive well, dug in a riverbed, was called a sip or Indian well. It could provide water for a small group of people for several days. Its walls were reinforced with stones or branches to prevent them from collapsing. Another promising place for digging was at the foot of the steep slopes or cliffs. Rainwater flowing down the slope accumulated at its base. A layer of soil and gravel acted as a sponge, retaining moisture. They also dug in places where the grass was lush and green. This was a sure sign that its roots reached a moist layer of soil. Even a single tall green plant in the middle of dry grass could indicate an underground source. Knowing these simple rules made it possible to find water in the most hopeless situations. It turned a desert plain into a potential source of life. The main thing was not to give up and keep searching. In northern regions and in the mountains, the problem of finding water in winter was easily solved. There was an abundance of it in the form of snow and ice. However, the use of these sources carried hidden dangers. Incorrect actions could lead to serious consequences. The most common mistake was consuming snow to quench thirst. The body expends a tremendous amount of energy to melt snow and warm the resulting water to body temperature. This led to rapid hypothermia and dehydration. The correct method was to melt the snow before consumption. It was collected in a pot and placed on the fire. If there was no fire, the snow could be melted by holding the container under clothing, closer to the body. The melting process also had its tricks. You couldn't fill the pot to the top with snow and put it on a strong fire. The bottom layer melted and the upper heat insulating layer of snow caused the bottom of the pot to burn through. First, a small amount of snow was melted, and then new portions were added to the water that had already formed. To obtain 1 liter of water, it was necessary to melt several liters of loose snow. Dense compacted snow or ice was much more effective. Ice from rivers or lakes was preferable because it contained less air. It was important to choose clean snow. Snow at the foot of trees, yellow or pink snow could contain impurities or microorganisms. Freshly fallen white snow from open spaces was considered the cleanest.
Pure water can be dangerous and cause dehydration, so we need to add...
Melted water contains virtually no salts or minerals. Constant consumption of such distilled water could lead to an imbalance of water and salt in the body. To avoid this, a pinch of salt or ash from a fire was added to the melted water. In winter, frozen rivers and lakes became a source of pure ice. The ice was cut with axes or saws, choosing the most transparent areas. Cloudy ice contained frozen air bubbles and impurities. The water was stored in melted form so as not to waste fuel every time. Barrels of water were kept near the fire or wrapped in skins and blankets to prevent them from freezing. Saving fuel in winter was critically important. Snow and ice were a reliable source, but they required proper handling. Finding water was only half the battle. In the next chapter, you will learn why even the cleanest-looking stream could be deadly. The greatest danger facing settlers was invisible to the eye. Crystal clear, cold water from a stream or spring could contain millions of disease-causing microorganisms. Consuming such water without prior treatment often led to serious consequences.
More careful.
The main source of contamination was animal waste. Upstream, there could be an animal carcass or simply a place where cattle grazed. Microorganisms from waste entered the water and made it dangerous. Stagnant water in ponds, lakes, and swamps was particularly risky. The lack of flow contributed to the growth of bacteria. Such water had an unpleasant smell and color, but when people were very thirsty, they sometimes ignored these signs. Even rainwater collected in natural depressions could be contaminated. Bird droppings, dust, and small particles from the surface of rocks fell into the water. Although it was safer than river water, the risk remained. The symptoms of poisoning did not appear immediately, but after several days. This made the situation even more dangerous. The caravan could have traveled far from the source of infection. People suffered from weakness, abdominal pain, and dehydration, which in the conditions of the journey was tantamount to a death sentence. The migrants did not have modern knowledge of microbiology. They attributed their ailments to bad air, fatigue, or spoiled food. The realization that water was the cause came too late. Experienced guides and mountain dwellers knew that the safest water could be found in fast-flowing mountain streams originating from glaciers. However, even here, there was no 100% guarantee. Water from deep wells was considered the safest. Passing through layers of sand and gravel, it underwent natural filtration. That is why the construction of wells was a priority in any new settlement. Some settlers tried to assess water quality by observing their animals. If horses or oxen drank the water willingly, it was considered safe. However, this method was not always reliable. Gradually, people realized that any water from an open source posed a potential threat. This led to the development of simple but effective purification methods. These methods saved thousands of lives and became the gold standard for survival.
This additional step will remove the turbidity and make the water more palatable for drinking.
The simplest and most effective way to disinfect water was boiling. High temperatures destroyed almost all dangerous bacteria and viruses. This method has been known since ancient times and became the main method for settlers. To be completely sure, the water had to be boiled for at least 10 minutes. At high altitudes where water boils at a lower temperature, the boiling time was increased. This simple rule was the key to the health of the entire caravan. The problem was that boiling required fuel. In treeless prairies or deserts, every splinter was worth its weight in gold. Precious firewood had to be conserved, using it primarily for cooking. Anything that could burn was used as fuel. Dry grass, wormwood, and bison dung, dried bison droppings, were all used. Bison dung provided a steady and long-lasting heat, which made it a particularly valuable fuel in the prairies. Kettles, which were an essential part of every settler's equipment, were used for boiling water. They were durable, lightweight, and allowed water to be heated quickly. The absence or breakage of a kettle became a serious problem. Boiled water had a specific, flat taste due to the lack of dissolved oxygen. To improve its taste, the water was poured several times from one container to another. This saturated it with oxygen and made it more pleasant to drink. After boiling, the water was allowed to cool. Drinking hot water in the heat was not only unpleasant, but also dangerous. It increased perspiration and led to even greater dehydration. The cooled water was stored in closed barrels or wineskins. In some cases, when it was not possible to light a fire, alternative methods were used. For example, stones heated in the sun were thrown into a leather wineskin with water. Although this did not bring the water to a boil, partial heating still reduced the number of bacteria. Boiling also helped to get rid of some chemical impurities and unpleasant odors. When boiled, some of the volatile compounds evaporated and suspended particles settled to the bottom. Despite its effectiveness, boiling did not remove turbidity, sand, and dirt from the water. The water became safe but not always pleasant to drink. But what if it was not possible to light a fire? In the next chapter, we will discuss methods that allowed people to do without it. When it was impossible to light a fire, settlers used filtration. This method did not disinfect the water, but it did remove turbidity, dirt, and large particles. The simplest filter could be made from readily available materials in a matter of minutes. The most common filter was ordinary cloth. Water was passed through several layers of cotton or wool fabric. This removed sand, silt, and other visible debris. A more complex filter was constructed from several layers. Grass, sand, charcoal, and then grass again were placed in layers in a container with a hole in the bottom, for example, a bucket or bag. Each layer performed its own function. The grass and cloth trapped large particles. The sand filtered out smaller particles. Charcoal from a fire was the most important element. It absorbed unpleasant odors and some chemical impurities. This multi-layer filter significantly improved the quality of the water. It became clear and lost its swampy smell. Although it was still unsafe from a microbiological point of view, it was much more pleasant to drink. After filtration, the water was often left to settle in the sun in a transparent container. The ultraviolet rays of sunlight have bactericidal properties and could destroy some of the microorganisms in a few hours. This method was not as reliable as boiling, but it was better than nothing. Sometimes plants were used for purification. A juniper branch or willow bark was placed in a container of water for several hours. They were believed to have disinfecting properties. Silver coins were also used. They were thrown into barrels of water for long-term storage. Silver ions do inhibit the growth of bacteria, so this method had a real basis. A combination of methods gave the best results. First, the water was filtered to make it clear, and then, if possible, boiled. If boiling was not possible, it was left to settle in the sun or silver was used. The ability to build a filter from whatever was at hand was a valuable skill. It made it possible to obtain drinkable water even from a muddy puddle. This knowledge saved people when there was no firewood or time for boiling. Filtration was a compromise between safety and accessibility. It did not provide a 100% guarantee, but it significantly reduced the risks. In survival situations, even a partial improvement in water quality was of great importance. In the most extreme situations, when there were no rivers or snow, migrants resorted to unconventional methods of obtaining water. They learned to extract precious moisture literally from the air. This method required patience, but it could save lives. Collecting morning dew was one such method. With the first rays of the sun, people went out to the meadows and collected dew from the grass by running pieces of cloth over it. The cloth was then squeezed into a container. In one morning, up to a liter of water could be collected in this way. It was a laborious and slow process, but in a desert area, it could be the only source of drinking water. The main thing was to start before the sun dried up the moisture.
Each step, filtering, boiling, and using silver.
Another method was the solar distiller, or condensation pit. A pit was dug in the ground, and a container for collecting water was placed in the center. The pit was covered with a piece of cloth or tarpaulin, weighing down the edges with stones, and a small pebble was placed in the center to create a slope. The sun's rays heated the ground in the pit. The moisture from the soil evaporated and condensed on the inside of the cloth. The drops flowed to the center and fell into the container. In one day, this method could collect a glass of clean, distilled water. Fresh leaves or grass could also be placed in the pit. The moisture evaporating from them increased the amount of water collected. This method was slow but reliable. Some plants themselves served as a source of water. For example, juice suitable for drinking could be extracted from the trunk of a grapevine. To do this, the vine was cut at the base and a container was placed underneath. Cacti also contained moisture, but they had to be handled with care. The juice of many species of cactus was bitter or toxic. Only experienced people could determine which species were safe to consume. Birch sap in the spring was another valuable source. It not only quenched thirst, but also contained vitamins and minerals that were necessary after a long winter. It was collected by making small cuts in the bark of the tree. These methods required a deep knowledge of nature and its cycles. They could not provide water for a large caravan, but for one or more people in a desperate situation, they were a chance for survival. Knowledge of hidden water sources was the highest skill in the art of survival. It showed how closely the settlers were connected to nature. For them, the earth was not just a territory, but a living organism that could share its secrets. The history of the conquest of the West is full of not only success stories, but also tragedies. Many of them were related to mistakes in finding and using water. Miscalculations that seemed simple at first glance led to the death of entire groups of settlers. One of the most common mistakes was blind faith in maps. Maps at that time were inaccurate, and a stream marked on them could have dried up many years ago. Relying too heavily on a single source without a plan B often ended tragically. Another mistake was misjudging distances and their own strength. Migrants tormented by thirst would see mountains or a green strip on the horizon and rush towards them without calculating their water supplies. They would die a few miles from salvation.
This water has a high alkaline content. It's got too many minerals.
Drinking water from alkaline lakes and springs was a deadly trap. Such water, rich in salts and minerals, did not quench thirst but intensified it. It caused severe internal disorders and rapid dehydration. Animals instinctively avoided such sources, but people driven to desperation could ignore this sign. The white salt deposits on the shores were a sure sign of danger, but not everyone knew this. Neglecting to purify water was another fatal mistake. Even after successfully finding a source, joy could be premature. One sip of contaminated water could turn a healthy person into a sick one in a matter of days. Panic was the worst enemy. Giving into fear, people made the wrong decisions. They abandoned their carts, split up, and set off in unknown directions. Calm and discipline were as important as a flask of water. Moving too quickly in the heat led to enormous moisture loss. Experienced guides traveled early in the morning and in the evening, resting in the shade during the midday heat. Attempting to rush through a dangerous section as quickly as possible often resulted in exhaustion. Conserving water was important, but excessive conservation could be harmful. By denying themselves water, people lost strength, the ability to think clearly, and the ability to make the right decisions. It was necessary to find a balance between conserving supplies and maintaining performance. Hoping for random rain was an illusion. The weather on the prairies was unpredictable, and droughts could last for months. The only things they could rely on were their knowledge and preparation. These mistakes cost many lives, but they also became lessons for future generations. Survivors passed on their bitter experiences, forming a set of rules. These rules, written at the cost of human lives, became the basis of the science of survival. Survival on the frontier depended not only on the ability to find water, but also on the ability to conserve it. Discipline in water consumption and storage was the basis of safety for any caravan. Everyone's life depended on it. Water rationing was a strict rule. The head of the caravan or family set a daily quota for each person and animal. Violation of this rule, even with the best of intentions, was severely punished. Water was stored in wooden barrels. Before the journey, they were carefully inspected for leaks, cleaned, and steamed. The loss of water due to a cracked barrel could be a disaster for the entire caravan. During the journey, the barrels were covered with wet cloth. The evaporation of water from the surface of the cloth cooled the barrel and its contents. This allowed the water to stay cool and fresh for longer. Everyone had their own flasks and water skins. They were filled from the common barrels every morning. Each person was responsible for the safety of their personal supply. Reusing water was common practice. Water used for washing dishes could be used to water plants or for technical needs. Every drop counted.
Every drop counts. We must make sure
The psychological aspect was extremely important. Constant thirst and anxiety about water supplies wore people down. The ability to remain calm and not give in to panic distinguished an experienced settler from a novice. Children were taught to conserve water from an early age. They knew that water was life and treated it with respect. This habit stayed with them for the rest of their lives. When a new source was found, supplies were replenished completely, even if the barrels were not yet empty. No one knew when the next opportunity would arise. This was the golden rule of the prairies. The ability to get by with a small amount of water was an art. People learned to drink in small sips, moisten their lips, and avoid salty foods that cause thirst. All of this helped to stretch precious supplies. Thus, the attitude toward water was not merely utilitarian. It was part of a culture of survival, a set of rituals and rules. Discipline and respect for water were the keys to successfully settling the Wild West. We have completed our journey into the harsh world of the Wild West, where water was more precious than gold. As we have seen, the survival of settlers depended on a complex set of skills, from the ability to read the landscape to understanding the psychology of thirst. Their methods, honed in the harshest conditions, became the basis for modern survival techniques. The history of the search for water on the frontier is not just a set of practical tips. It is a story of human resilience, ingenuity, and the ability to adapt to the most hostile conditions. This knowledge, paid for at a high price, allowed people to master the continent. What other aspects of frontier survival would you like us to cover in future episodes? Perhaps you are interested in building shelters, hunting tricks, or food preservation methods. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new research.